If doctors told us that we'd made a breakthrough on COVID-19, we would rejoice. We'd feel hope that we could live our lives again, get back to work, back to doing what we want. Well, masks are a ticket to that freedom. We can help protect others and save lives by covering our noses and mouths, which is how the virus mainly spreads. Until there's a vaccine, grab the breakthrough that's already here. When we're out, it's masks on. A message to help keep you safe.
Brought to you by the Ad Council.
20 seconds to air. Stand by, all cameras.
Stand by in videotape. Stand by slow-mo.
Stand by to open your mics on the field.
Stand by in graphics. Ready with your opening supers. Stand by the announcers in the booth, please. And roll tape.
3, 2, 1. Take tape.
This shot from the top of the Astrodome in Houston, Texas. A sellout crowd on hand, 50,000. It could have been 100,000. Tonight's attraction, one of the hottest tickets in recent years here in Houston. And live from the Astrodome, ABC's NFL Monday Night Football, a top AFC matchup. The Miami Dolphins against the Houston Oilers. This ABC Sports exclusive is being brought to you by GMC Truck and Coach Division of General Motors and your local GMC dealer. At GMC, trucks are what we're all about. And by Lowenbrau. When you want the taste of a truly great beer, there's really only one. Tonight, let it be Lowenbrau.
There are the standings in the AFC Eastern Division. A win for Miami tonight would tie them with the Pats, who beat the Jets in a tough one yesterday. But New England and Miami both quite apparently headed for the playoffs. There are the standings in the AFC Central Division. Pittsburgh ahead of Houston, but Houston very much alive for a playoff berth and good enough to have beaten Pittsburgh on a Monday night early. Remember, a great game, 24-17. The crowd behind me roaring, pom-poms everywhere in display as the Houston Oilers are about to be introduced. Hello again, everyone. We think tonight we've got about as good a matchup as you could have in the National Football League at this stage of the season.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right, here we go. Let's get into it, folks. How you doing? My name is Tim Hanlon, and it's Good Seats Still Available. Yeah, it's the curious little podcast, our little journey each and every week into what used to be in professional sports. And as you can guess by our little clip there as we start our show this week, we're back into football, and boy, it's not just football, it's Houston Oilers football. Yeah, Houston Oilers #1. We'll get into that in a few minutes too. If you grew up and live in Houston, maybe you fancy yourself a fan of the Texans now, you might want to ask your elders perhaps what was going on in the decades prior to the Texans' arrival. The Houston Oilers, what a team. It certainly made a lasting impression, and it still does, frankly, for any Houstonian. And frankly, people in Texas and the AFC, the old AFC or the current AFC, whatever, and the old AFL for that matter. What a story this was, and frankly, in many respects, kind of continues to be. The legacy very much lives on, the colors and the logo, the name, and of course the history. And we're going to get into the story of the Houston Oilers this week with our special guest, Ed Fowler, the Reverend Ed Fowler, retired, but still actually a real, honest to goodness, Anglican church minister / Reverend Ed Fowler is an interesting part of the story here too. We'll sort of get into that interesting career change and what was Ed prior to his higher calling, shall we say. He was a longtime sports writer. Yeah, largely in the the Houston metropolitan area with the Houston Chronicle. But before that, places like the Austin American-Statesman, the Kansas City Star, the Chicago Daily News, here closer to us, or what used to be closer to us, back in the day when newspapers were a thing, and sports writing in those newspapers were more than the thing. They were probably, frankly, the sort of unwritten reason why a lot of people actually subscribed, because the sports section was not only journalism, but also a diversion from the distractions of a crazier world in the earlier sections of a newspaper. But Ed Fowler is an interesting story himself, but also the topic at hand that we're going to get into. We're going to use him and his book that came out in the late 90s. Yeah, there you go. It was 1997 in particular. And this is how we sort of discovered and got in contact with Ed. The book is called Loser Takes All. Bud Adams, key part of the story for sure. Bud Adams, Bad Football, and Big Business. It's really the story of the Houston Oilers and sort of how it came and messily went. And our conversation this week with Ed Fowler gets into the story of the book, the story of the Oilers, and as you can imagine, we try to tackle, no pun intended, yes pun intended, all of those issues relating to the ups, and certainly there were a number of them, but largely downs, especially on the way out of the Houston Oilers. Now, of course, represented in reconstituted form as the Tennessee Titans. And yes, we talk about the Tennessee Oilers for a couple of years. Again, the messy departure from Houston. And at last check, not a whole lot of oil in anywhere in the state of Tennessee. But no, that didn't stop the team from still being called the Tennessee Oilers for a couple of years before they firmly and officially domiciled themselves in Nashville. 2 years, many forget, were prior to that in Tennessee, in Memphis at the Liberty Bowl. That's when they were known as the Tennessee Oilers, and before becoming the Titans. All part of the lore and the legacy and the very interesting stories related to that. And the clip at the beginning kind of gives us sort of a hint. It's certainly it's debatable as to when the era in the late 70s really kind of started. It is known without conjecture, however, as let's call it the Love Ya Blue era. This is around the time, late 1978, 79, 80 or so, when the Houston Oilers were probably amongst the hottest, if not in certain areas of NFL football, the hottest team going, with an amazing array of stars, including one hot rookie by the name of Earl Campbell. Phenomenon really is an understatement, I guess, not only in Houston, but in the NFL itself. And it took a little while to kind of congeal into what actually became a trademarked phenomenon, literally called Love Ya Blue. But most scholars would kind of circle around November 20th, 1978, and the Monday Night Football game that you just heard a little clip from, the intro to, Frank Gifford and Howard Cosell and Dandy Don, where the Oilers were hosting a nationally televised game against the Miami Dolphins, and was kind of sort of a burst of energy and color and noise that absolutely came across on the broadcast. The pom-poms waving everywhere, and a hell of a game. And actually, many people think that is perhaps one of the best Monday Night Football games of all time. That game when the Oilers won a very entertaining game. It's all there on YouTube behind Earl Campbell's almost 200 rushing yards. I want to say he had, it was 199 actually, 4 touchdowns he ran for. And the Oilers won out in a 35-30 victory. Certainly others might look at some later games, but this was a national sort of shot across the bow, so to speak, and there was a lot of energy and going on there. Some would also, frankly, suggest that the next year, around December 10th, 1979, December 10th, 1979, about a year later, was when sort of the Love You Blue sort of trademark era, I guess, sort of occurred. But regardless of when you think it was also another Monday Night Football game, by the way, regardless of how you sort of circle around it, if you were there at the time, and or you were just an NFL fan at the time paying attention, it's probably burned into your memory what this Love You Blue phenomenon was. And it was absolutely a heady time, arguably the apex of the excitement that was this franchise. Plenty of nadirs, of course, along the way. But you have to remember that the AFL, when it was started, the Houston Oilers were one of the franchises that helped launch that league. And we get into one of the chief protagonists, maybe actually antagonists, as we get into the cut. But Bud Adams, for sure, was there at the beginning and there through the entirety of this team, as well as how it went to Tennessee ultimately. He is the good guy, certainly in the beginning years for sure, winning 2 AFL championships early on, and kind of making a mark for pro football in Houston when there was none prior. Certainly gets all the accolades, I guess, around the Love You Blue era for sure. But look, he was also very enmeshed and hands-on, shall we say, to a fault for the majority of the years otherwise. And I would argue that essentially, not unlike the title of Ed Fowler's book, the experience of being an Oilers fan was largely, I wouldn't say necessarily lamentable, but certainly heartbreaking and disappointing, especially when they were tantalizingly close to some playoff glory that, frankly, sort of eluded them, not only in the Love You Blue era, but certainly thereafter as well. We get into all of that. It's the Houston Oilers, our first tackling of the topic, with our guest this week, the Reverend Ed Fowler, and we look forward to presenting it to you in mere moments. Before we get there, let's get some promotional goodness out of the way. The holidays, believe it or not, despite all the distractions that we have in life, are literally right around the corner. Make sure you get a pen and paper and let's write these down, shall we? These are the sites that you want to sort of circle, and bookmark and go to for all the forgotten sports fans in your life, whether they be family members or friends. This is here are the places you want to go to get the best in merchandise for our little genre of forgotten sports. And here we go. Streakersports.com, the purveyors of sports culture. 15% discount when you use the promo code GOODSEATS. Awesome stuff at streakersports.com. Lots of sports cultural stuff, including plenty of forgotten and abandoned and previously existing leagues and teams and such. Sportshistorycollectibles.com. Yes, the better, well-lit eBay, if you will. It is the curated home of the best in forgotten sports memorabilia. Promo code there is GOODSEATS. That's 15% off all of your purchases there at sportshistorycollectibles.com. New stuff just about every week and great photographs of all of it. Check it out, sportshistorycollectibles.com, promo code GOODSEATS. Don't forget 417 Helmets, 417helmets.com. It's collectible helmets and more. And it's not just for pro football teams and the like, but also all kinds of stuff, cultural stuff. You want to create something custom. Maybe there was an elected official that you want to commemorate on a helmet, or for hell, maybe it's even a team in another league. Our pal Judd Lasher down in Metropolitan St. Louis can help you out. 417helmets.com, promo code GOODSEATS, 10% off your purchases there. Oldschoolshirts.com. Yes, just like the name implies, not only great sports stuff of yore, but great pop culture stuff as well. Restaurants, various city logos, radio station logos, etc. All there at oldschoolshirts.com, promo code GOODSEATS, 10% off all of your purchases there. And last but certainly not least, our friends at 503 Sports, 503-sports.com, the king of throwbacks. Yes, not only great shirts of teams and leagues no longer with us, but also great handcrafted custom jerseys for many of those same teams. 503 Sports, that's 503-sports.com, promo code SEATS for 10% off all of your purchases there. Thank you to all of our great sponsors. Thank you for checking them out, bookmarking, and buying for your holiday needs. And thank you, of course, for continuing to listen as we get into our wonderful chat with the lovely Reverend Ed Fowler as we talk about his previous life, but we get into his current life too, around the Houston Oilers and the story of such. Here it is. As always, please enjoy. All right, so let's, for the sake of our audience who tends to be just fanatical about various topics, and obviously when we put this out there, obviously Houston and the Oilers and football and all that kind of stuff will certainly gravitate to a lot of people on a lot of people's radars. But let's set the table a little bit because why don't we kind of fast forward to today and where we find you both physically as well as career and psychically. And then we can sort of backtrack, I guess, into how you are well-versed on the topic at hand.
All right. Today, physically, I am found in Galveston, Texas. We moved to the historic east end of Galveston in March of this year on Super Tuesday, as a matter of fact, about a week before the world turned upside down. We have been here for over half a year now. I am retired from my second career. I came to saving faith rather late in life, well into middle age, and that led me to late in life calling into vocational ministry. To sort of shorten the story, I ended up going to seminary and being ordained a priest, presbyter, shortened form of that is priest in the Reformed Episcopal Church, which is a confessional, which is to say conservative Anglican body. I served churches in Durango, Colorado, and then Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, and then retired almost 3 years ago. Spent a couple of years in the Hot Springs, Arkansas area, and then we moved to Galveston.
And so that's a fantastic second career, but I think it's even more interesting once people sort of know what your first career was. How about a little bit of background on that?
Yeah, sure. I as a well-scrubbed young freshman at the University of Texas, in 1965, I marched into the offices of the Daily Texan, the campus newspaper, and said, "Here I am, what will you let me do?" And the snooty senior managing editor looked down her nose at me and said, "I have nothing for you, but you might go try sports." Well, the sports editor said, "Do you know anything about football?" I said, "I played it in high school." He said, "Good, I need somebody to cover the freshman team." We still had freshman teams back then. And so that was my point of introduction. I worked for a year on the school paper. At the end of my freshman year, I was hired by the Austin American-Statesman, continued working there through school. I covered the Texas team that won the national championship in 1969. I went from there to the Kansas City Star, from there to the Chicago Daily News. Covered the White Sox for 3 seasons back in the Dick Don't Call Me Richie Allen era. and then went back home to Houston and became a columnist at the Houston Chronicle. And that's what I did for 17 years. And I ended up writing Loser Takes All toward the end of that tenure.
So for you young whippersnappers out there, right, this is back in the day when there was these things called newspapers. And not only were these things called newspapers, but there were these substantial components of them called sports departments. And sports writing was also a major thing, mostly in the printed form. Obviously, I'm over embellishing here, but the reality is that the idea of being a sports writer, I mean, you've mentioned, these are major, or certainly were major newspapers in their respective markets, right? Mm-hmm. And the teams that you were covering, right? I'm assuming this was pro, collegiate, all of the above.
Well, yeah, those last 2 decades almost, when I was a columnist, this was in the heyday of sports journalism, before the internet ruined the newspaper business, and I pretty much had carte blanche. I was at Super Bowls and World Series and Olympics and Masters and British Opens and US Opens and World Cup and on and on and on.
And was there any particular sort of beat that you were especially good at, or oriented towards, or assigned to, or were you general interest? And it almost sounds like you might be a bit of more of a sort of a national sports kind of correspondent for these local brands.
Well, yeah, early on, I was a baseball writer in Chicago. I covered the White Sox. And then after I moved to the Houston Chronicle, I still and became a columnist. I still had an interest and focus on baseball, but of course, football too. That was my sport as a youngster, and you can't very well be a sports columnist in Texas without a heavy dose of football. So I guess those were the big two for me. And then later on, when I discovered golf, I started making the Masters and the US Open and the British Open and the Ryder Cups and those sorts of things. And I really enjoyed golf, and I enjoyed the travel associated with it, playing golf in the UK and that sort of thing.
So how do you I guess focus in on the Oilers specifically? Because if I'm not mistaken, this is the only sports book that you've put out there, right?
No, it is. That's true. Yeah.
So I guess I'm curious as to how the Oilers become a story for you. But obviously, there's the AFL Oilers, and then obviously the transition into the NFL. I suspect that pro football in Houston was probably more on your radar before you were, I'm guessing, generally assigned to cover it. And I'm assuming at the Houston Chronicle.
Well, I grew up with football in Houston. As I think I mentioned, Houston's home for me. I remember going to Oilers games with my dad at what was called Jeppesen Stadium back then on the University of Houston campus. So I certainly had an awareness. We also went to Rice games at Rice Stadium. I still remember LSU coming to town with Billy Cannon back when Rice was number one in the nation for a brief time in 1956. And back in those years, LSU would come to town with Billy Cannon and win, and I would have to endure in the parking lot after the game, listening to all the Cajuns chanting, "Poor Owls." It tore me up. So yeah, I went back a ways with football, both college and pro in Houston.
Well, but I'm guessing, so if you were at UT around 1965 or so, that by my estimation then means that you were, and this is a theme in a lot of our investigations of various teams and people remembering them and stuff, your formative teenage years, right, were probably around those first years of not only the original Houston Oilers, but the AFL in particular, specifically, right, overall. And, by the way, the Houston Oilers were the first two champions of this new AFL in 1661.
Yeah, yeah, sure, absolutely. Yeah, they had, it was very much a minor league back then, and we understood that. It wasn't the NFL until the merger, but still, it was football. It was professional football. It was our team, and we were very much into all of that.
Well, so when does the story and this book for you and the I guess the chronicling of, no pun, maybe pun, of the team and of their doings, when does it cross, I guess, time wise for you from being a childhood fan and maybe even an adult fan into this is the gig, you're covering them and you are now part of telling the story, maybe on a daily basis or even more so, of the Oilers?
Well, I had gravitated from Austin to Kansas City to Chicago and then back to Houston. I became the lead columnist on the Houston Chronicle in 1980. So I was, while I wasn't the beat reporter, I was still around the team a lot. I made virtually every road trip, I think. Again, this was a different era in the newspaper business. I mean, we would send 6 writers and 2 photographers on the road with the Oilers. And so I was present for all that. I was at, usually during the season, I was out at, while I wasn't a football writer, I was still out at practice on average once a week. And I wrote a lot about the Oilers. The book came about when the publisher came to me and said, hey, we want this, we want you to do this. We like your work. We think there's a place for this book, and here's an advance, and we want you to write it.
Well, it's interesting that around 1980 or so is when you were kind of first sort of spilling some ink on the Oilers team, because this was probably about the first time in their NFL existence, i.e. after the merger in 69 and 70, or arguably the merger was underway before that. But because this is sort of the first real taste, I guess, of the Oilers actually being competitive, with Bum Phillips at the behind the scenes, pulling all the strings, and Earl Campbell, of course, blazing away. I'm just curious as to, as you become sort of more, shall we say, professionally responsible for at least some level of covering and commenting on this team, what was sort of the Oilers' experience around that time? Because I think that's when a lot of people really, maybe for the first time generationally, certainly I can remember growing up in the New York metro area, the Oilers were actually one of the teams you'd hope for would be on Monday Night Football because they were actually exciting and fun to watch. Right. But that wasn't always the case, certainly in the first decade in the NFL, and certainly a long time away from their early success back in the beginnings of the AFL.
Yeah. Well, the one constant in Oilers history was the owner, K.S. Bud Adams. He was an oil man, the son of an Oklahoma oil man. He grew up in Bartlesville in northern Oklahoma and made his way to Houston in the oil business, became involved in lots of other businesses as well. And he was a, shall we say, quixotic figure. So they had the early success. As you mentioned, they won the AFL Championship the first 2 years. But he made some interesting and unfortunate personnel choices along the way. And they wandered in the desert for quite a long time in the early NFL days. And I moved back to Houston in 1975. I started writing sports in Houston in 1978 and then became a columnist in 1980. So I was present there for the Bum Phillips, or what's called the Love You Blue era.
Sure.
And it's pretty hard. It's pretty hard thinking back through all those years to describe it in a way that's tactile to people who weren't there. It was probably, I still think, the greatest love affair between a city and a team, certainly a team that never won the big prize in the history of American sports. I mean, Houston was just enraptured with the Oilers, and we had, these fight songs and all this kind of college-y sort of atmosphere. And they went to Pittsburgh and lost the first AFC Championship game they played in, and they came back And the word had gotten out that there was going to be a sort of a pep rally to welcome the team back home. I mean, they got hammered in Pittsburgh. I think it was 34-5.
Yeah, this is the 1978 season. Yeah.
Yeah. And the Astrodome was bursting at the seams. I mean, it was overflow. It was this giant party for a team that had just gotten clobbered in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh was an immeasurably more talented team. I mean, that was Swan and Stallworth and Bradshaw and Ham and Lambert and Franco Harris and Mean Joe Green. I mean, you know, this was a whole team of Hall of Famers, and the Oilers had Earl Campbell, and that was pretty much it for, I mean, real superstar level talent. And yet Bum Phillips had these guys playing so far over their heads that the city just became infatuated with them. And then they went back to the AFC Championship game in Pittsburgh the following year and lost again, a much more competitive game that might have gone differently if not for a real controversial call and a catch in the end zone. And so, you know, the Cowboys had pretty much owned Texas up until the Bum Phillips days. But during Phillips' tenure there, I mean, there were radio stations all over the state. I mean, even in West Texas, clearing the Oilers games that had no interest before. And the whole state, not to say the Cowboys were ever forgotten or lost their following, they didn't, but they certainly gave up a big chunk of it to the Oilers. It was a phenomenon.
Well, all right, so lots to unpack there, but let's talk about Phillips for a minute, because Bum Phillips, obviously, you know, he came in, he had a bunch of experiences, right? I mean, kind of going back and forth between sort of high school and assistant coaching in various collegiate sort of environments. But so he came around the same time that you came back to Houston as well. Right. I think he started, I guess he was the head coach at 75 onward, but I think he at the time prior to that, the year before, was a defensive coordinator. So maybe a little bit more about this guy, where he came from, because he certainly, while he had a pretty interesting high school and lightly seasoned collegiate career, probably not the guy most people would expect to generate the excitement that by the end of the decade was, you know, fueling this love affair for this team on a number of different levels.
Yeah, number one, he was local. He was from the Port Arthur Beaumont area, about 90 miles north of Houston. He was the consummate good old boy. I mean, he really did chew tobacco, and he did wear a cowboy hat. It wasn't just a prop for TV. He was quintessential Texas, and he was an easy guy to love. He was also, I mean, his players adored him. As I said, they played way over their heads for him. I think he probably got the job through his association with Sid Gilman, who had been a coach of the Oilers before him.
Well, sure. But, and Sid Gilman, by the way, obviously very well known to people in the if you people harken back to some of our previous episodes on the old New York Titans, the predecessor to the New York Jets, right? Sid Gilman, very much in that story.
Yeah, he was a prominent NFL figure, right? Bum was one of the most genuine people I've ever encountered. I mean, I'd put him in a class with Nolan Ryan. What you see was what you got. There were never any pretense. He never put on airs. He had a code of his own. I remember him being asked one time, because he was known to love beer. He loved to drink beer. He drank beer on the team charter. He drank beer all over the place. And he was asked once why he never did a beer commercial. And he said, well, I ain't having no youngster getting drunk and smashing up his car on my account. So, you know, he had a code. Everyone respected him. Everyone who knew him admired him. And he, you know, I think he said something along the lines of, the coach's job is to make the the mediocre player average and the average player good and the good player great. And that's what he did. And he had some unorthodox methods for doing it.
Well, so explain to me then, you were mentioning sort of the Love You Blue thing, but I was the love affair with the team in the Houston metro area underway, shall we say, before Phillips arrived in 74, 75? Or were there other aspects that maybe, because they were certainly not doing tremendously well on the field prior to that?
No, it wasn't. I mean, it was Houston's team, and so Houston had an affection for the team, just as any other city would for its pro football team. But the other piece that you have to add to the Bum Phillips element was Earl Campbell. Again, a Texas guy from Tyler. He went to the University of Texas, won the Heisman Trophy there, and now he's drafted by the Oilers. And he was a force to behold on the football field. I mean, the combination of speed and power was just virtually unprecedented. And so, once again, you have the local angle. You got Bum from Texas. You got Earl from Texas. Earl, again, while a very different personality, I think you'd say a genuine sort, and a guy who was easy for people to like. You put that together with Dan Pastorini, who had a flair. He had a flair for the big play. He also lived large, had a speedboat, dated movie stars, that sort of thing. So it was I guess the whole package in that sense.
Before we sort of get back to the on-the-field exploits, and obviously, I don't want to gloss over. I mean, Earl Campbell, obviously Hall of Famer, both at the collegiate and the professional level. I think it's lost on a lot of people. Obviously, a lot of people certainly know and revere him for his exploits on the field. But he was, if I have my numbers correct, he was most valuable player in the league in, I think it was 78. And he was the offensive player of the year in the league for 3 straight years from, I think it was 78 through 80. I mean, that's, I don't know, it's unprecedented. It may be, frankly, but that's, you're mentioning the Steelers team that they found themselves falling down on 2 straight AFC championships. But, this guy was, if there was a crown jewel in the league at this time, you could argue that Earl Campbell was it, if not one of the its.
Well, I think so. I think that's a perfectly valid case. He was almost superhuman. I still remember going into to the opponent's locker rooms after games, and the defensive players would be shaking their heads and they'd be saying things like, "He can't last. He can't last," because on every play it seemed he was taking 3 and 4 and 5 hits before he went down. Well, it sounded like sour grapes at the time when you heard those guys say those things. But in the end, it was probably true. I mean, he had a great career, but it was a fairly short career. After Bud Adams fired Bum and Bum went to coach the New Orleans Saints, Bum took Earl over there traded for him and took him over there with him. And Earl was never anything approaching the player he'd been at Houston. And later in life, he's had some serious cognitive issues. I mean, the man just took an incredible pounding because he stayed, well, as Bum put it one time when somebody observed that Earl was really slow getting up, Bum said, "Yeah, well, he's really slow going down, too." And he was. It took an army to get him on the ground.
Well, for sure, and all the video shows it, right? I mean, and it's also even more interesting. To clarify, he was Earl was the MVP of the league in '79, but he was Offensive Player of the Year for 78, 79, and 80, and he was also the Offensive Rookie of the Year, right, in 70. I think people sort of forget that Earl made this splash coming right out of college, right? Which, is certainly possible, but is not always the easiest thing, making that transition from the collegiate game to the pro game, right?
Yeah, he was that good. He didn't miss a beat. He was as dominant a force in the pros as he had been in college. And yeah, that's very rare.
Well, so tell me about the Love You Blue thing, right? Because I'm just really curious about how the fans sort of took to this, right? It's interesting in my research, and I knew enough. I mean, I certainly remember that original Houston Oilers #1 song, which I think, by the way, we'll have embedded in our episode once we drop this. But I think on a per capita basis, the Houston Oilers may have had more official and unofficial theme songs in their career than just about any team that we've explored thus far.
Houston has the Oilers, the greatest football team. We take the ball from goal to goal like no one's ever seen. We're in the air, we're on the ground, always in control. And when you say the Oilers, you're talking Super Bowl, 'cause we're the Houston Oilers. Houston Oilers, Houston Oilers #1. Yes, we're the Houston Oilers. Houston Oilers, Houston Oilers #1.
I guess that's a testament to just how much this love affair you mentioned earlier sort of was really. Can you somehow describe what this Love You Blue sort of phenomenon was like to the average Houstonite or Houstonian?
The Oilers had a center in that area named Carl Mock, and he was, I guess I'd maybe call him a cowboy poet type. he concocted this fight song that had this line about from the fancy Passandago to the Tyler Bowling Ball, Pastorini, Earl Campbell, and they take the ball from goal to goal like no one's ever seen, and just a simple little jingle sort of thing, and it caught fire. And people all over town were singing it, I suppose, and it was sung during the games. And it was part of the whole Love You Blue picture. It was Love You Blue set to music, I suppose.
Love you blue, you know that we do. We'll always be true, 'cause we love you blue. Yes, we love you blue.
How about the Astrodome itself, right? Obviously, still the crown jewel, I guess, of modern stadium architecture at the time. How much of that was part of the mix, or was it just kind of that was Houston's just stadium? And I guess how special was that environment? I mean, sound wise, all that kind of stuff.
Certainly special sound-wise, yeah, all that sound stayed in, and there was plenty of noise to stay in. The Astrodome, by the time the Oilers came along, wasn't a novelty. Bud Adams intended the Oilers to play in the Astrodome from the beginning, but even after it was completed, there were some contract issues that couldn't be worked out. And they ended up playing at Jefferson Stadium on the University of Houston campus, and then Rice Stadium, which seated 72,000. But they didn't get into the Astrodome until I think it was the third year. So by then, the new had worn off a bit. But yeah, in terms of an electric atmosphere, there was probably no place like it.
Yeah, although it was unique in that, I guess, from a football perspective, it wasn't. I mean, I guess the 50-yard line seats, right, were probably like a lot of sort of circular stadiums, right? They were actually the furthest away from the field, right? So it's, I get the sense that Adams, despite it being a couple of years before they got into the Astrodome, that the Astros were considered, as the primary tenant versus the Oilers. Is that a fair assessment, or am I just reading into that?
Well, they were, and they held the. Well, no, they were in a formal sense the primary tenant. They held the lease, and Bud Adams had to go to the Astros to sublease the dome for his team.
Interesting. All right. Well, let me use that as a backdrop, I guess, for Adams particularly. I guess I want to get into his sort of like his psyche because, another big part of the story, again, to somebody who's as uninitiated as I am to it, I was surprised at, frankly, the longevity of his ownership from the earliest of foundational days in the AFL all the way through the messy exit into Nashville, or to Tennessee, then Nashville. He describe him as an owner, because I get the sense that he was, well, you sort of hinted at it, but micromanager is a term that I keep seeing in the research. Like he kind of meddled a little too much, perhaps, in some of the sort of more, day-to-day operations, maybe?
Well, that went in fits and starts. There were stretches when he was very hands-on. There were other stretches when, I don't know, I guess he became occupied with other things and wasn't so involved. But, if we're looking at the whole Love You Blue saga and then the beginning of the end in Houston, we have to look at Bud Adams hiring a general manager named Lad Herzig. Herzig was an accountant, literally a CPA, who had worked for the Cleveland Browns, and that's where Adams met him. He brought him in, made him general manager, and Herzig had real control issues, shall we say. The perception was that he resented Bum getting all the glory. And Herzig had managed to convince himself that he was a shrewd evaluator of talent and that he was responsible for drafting the players that achieved all the success that they had during that era. He was also an erratic individual, to put it charitably. Just for a couple of examples, he was married. He had a child by a stewardess who worked the team's charter flights. He made his fatherhood known, and he hoisted the little girl when she was, a year old or so, on his shoulders before a game and paraded all the way around the perimeter of the inner perimeter of the Astrodome, with the stadium filling with fans. In Buffalo, on the night before a game there, he got into an argument with some rather loud members of a wedding party at the team hotel and dropped his trousers and mooned these people. That was Lad Herzig, and he wanted Bum Phillips out, and he got him out. In 1980, the Oilers played the last game of the Bum Phillips era in Oakland. In a wild card game, they lost decisively to the Raiders, and I believe it was the next day, the Oilers announced that Bum Phillips had been fired. So when you think in terms of Adams and who he was and how he operated, you have to put Herzig in that mix. And the whole history of the franchise would have been much, much different if he'd had a more conventional, shall we say, general manager and someone who wanted to work with Bum Phillips.
What was the Houston fan response to Phillips being so unceremoniously relieved of duties after that?
Oh, it was outrage. What can you do about it? But we've just been describing the relationship Bum had with the city. Well, they certainly weren't going to turn on him after one more playoff loss, even if it was in the wild card round. They were going to the playoffs year in, year out. I mean, it was routine.
It was the second straight year they went 11-5 in the regular season, right? I mean,
yeah. I mean, there was outrage. I don't recall, but if Bud didn't get death threats, I'd be surprised.
Well, it didn't take long though for the team to tank on the field. I mean, I think they were down to I think in '82 they were down to 1-8, which I know obviously there was this strike related stuff, but at 2-14 in 1983, 3-13 in 1984. The tone for the '80s certainly. What a disappointment given all of the excitement, the enthusiasm, and the success in the late '70s.
Yeah, as we've been saying, the players gave everything they had for Bum Phillips. Well, no one was going to replicate that, and certainly the coaches who followed didn't. And you got this, frankly, pretty mediocre bunch. Ed Biles, and then Herzig went to Canada. He wanted a quarterback named Warren Moon, who'd had a lot of success in Canada. And so to get Moon to sign with the Oilers, he hired his Canada coach, Hugh Campbell. I remember by this time I was hosting a daily radio show, and I had Ray Childress, the defensive tackle, on my show as a weekly guest. And I asked him off air one day. This was after Campbell had left, but I asked Childress off air. I said, "What was practice like when Hugh Campbell was here?" Ray said, "Well, mostly we stood around for a couple hours and then we went home." So it was an undistinguished sort of record after Bum Phillips for a long time. Yes.
But in the late '80s, there was some return to some winning ways, and I find it interesting that it seems like around that time is also when Adams, and I wonder if it was because of the renewed playoff success of the Oilers or despite it, that he, in parallel, started raising hackles about potentially moving the team either to Jacksonville or maybe just as a threat to get some improvements done to the Astrodome, which, at that time then was in the late '80s was, we're looking at almost 25 years of existence at that point.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Two things there. The primary reason for their resurgence on the field was a fellow named Mike Holovac. Mike was maybe the best personnel man, well, certainly the best I've ever known about. I think he was as good as any as the NFL has ever known. If you go back and look at the rosters in those years in the late 80s, early 90s when Holovac was on the scene, you'll see the Oilers sent 10, 11, 12 players to the Pro Bowl year after year. He could find football players, and he could find them in the 7th round. And that's why they sort of turned things around, never in the sense of winning big in the playoffs, but they had a lot of regular season success. They also had a coach that Herzig brought in named Jerry Glanville, who was frankly self-destructive. I still remember one game they lost in Cincinnati when Sam Weich's Bengals poured it on them, beat them by 3 or 4 touchdowns. And Weich just went off after the game and said everything that other coaches had been saying privately, that they wanted nothing like they so badly as they wanted to beat Jerry Glanville's Oilers, because he would put bounties on, the kicker and that sort of cheap stuff. So that was going on the field. Now, in terms of Bud wanting out. The big impetus there was that these new stadiums were starting to come online in other cities, and he saw how profitable they were for his fellow owners, and he wanted a piece of that action. So he became the first, I don't know if this is still true, but he was certainly the first, if he's not the only owner in pro sports, to put the gun to the same city's head twice. He started threatening to move to Jacksonville. He did it in a highly public way. There were pictures on Houston television of him stepping off a helicopter in the middle of the field in Jacksonville. This was before Jacksonville, of course, had an NFL team. And so he used that for leverage, and Houston agreed to do improvements to the Astrodome that included adding 60-some, I believe, luxury boxes, which were a big revenue generator, and adding seats and doing various things. And the bill, as I recall, was $67 million. So all that happened. He got his way, and everything was supposed to be fine. Well, it was fine until he decided he still wasn't getting enough revenue, and he could get more with a new stadium, which he had to have. So he starts romancing the folks in Nashville. It was always Nashville. Yeah, they ended up going to Tennessee, to Memphis for a couple of years first, but that was just a way station while Nashville got its stadium built. He started romancing Nashville. Bob Lanier was the mayor of Houston at the time, probably the best mayor the city ever had. And I remember sitting in his office and him telling me, look, the city, it was actually a city-county joint venture. The city and county still owe tens of millions of dollars on the Astrodome upgrades. There's no way I can go back to the downtown business community and get them agree to more tens of millions of dollars for a brand new stadium. And so they in the end said, no, we're not going to go for it. And he picked up his toy and left.
Well, it's interesting, too, because the part of that leverage, though, right, was a team that was now, after kind of a number of seasons in the 80s, having sort of basically gone wayward into seeming oblivion on the field. I mean, they were actually, this was a perennial playoff team again with, under Glanville, certainly Jack Pardee. You had a team that, was routinely finishing second or in a couple of seasons first in the AFC Central, right? So I'm guessing that didn't hurt, right? Versus a team that was, shall we say, more moribund in the earlier part of the decade, right? That probably had to at least instill. But I'm guessing, though, or you tell me, was the fan enthusiasm as manic, I guess, as it was back in the first sort of iteration of the Love You Blue era earlier?
Well, it never reached that level. That was supersonic back in the Love You Blue era. But sure, it was a team that was winning a lot. But again, by this time, Jack Pardee came from the University of Houston and installed what he called his run and shoot offense with a bunch of little midget receivers running around all over the place. And they had a lot of success with that. And so, yeah, they were certainly popular in town. But again, whatever else can be said, you're going to come up against this issue of we still owe, I don't know the number, $30-40 million, whatever it was, on the Astrodome. And now we're going to shell out $150 million, whatever it was, for a new stadium. And as far as, what sort of leverage he had in Nashville, I don't know enough about Nashville to know. My sense was they were so hungry. They didn't have a pro major league pro franchise of any sort. And I think if the Oilers had been winless, they would probably have done what they did in terms of their stadium deal for Bud.
Now, I wonder, now that I'm thinking about it, the dark years, I guess, of the early and most of the early through mid 80s. I'm wondering what kind of effect the the USFL's Houston Gamblers had during that time, because that was a pretty exciting team in a very interesting league, obviously in the spring and all that kind of stuff. But did the Gamblers' relative success, or at least interest or difference, I guess, from what the Oilers were at the time, did that have any competitive or lasting or any resonating effect on the stability or the interest of the fans of the Oilers franchise in the NFL?
Not a lot. The Gamblers did have success. Jim Kelly, of course, was he went on to be an excellent NFL quarterback. But they were still the newcomers. The Oilers were the established brand. I don't know if anyone was ever absolutely convinced that the USFL was going to endure. So it was an issue, but I wouldn't call it a real big issue.
Before we sort of get into the denouement of the team, and then ultimately and sort of oddly getting into Tennessee and ultimately to Nashville, from your recollections, like what was it about this team? I mean, in covering it, you mentioned you weren't the beat reporter, but I suspect you spend more than your fair share of going to games and being part of the coverage of the team, both in their halcyon days as well as in their lean years in between. Any particular memories, aside from the ones you've shared already, that sort of pop to mind that either are indicative of what the team was like, or just stuck out in terms of people and personalities and, and frankly, maybe along the lines of where your book goes, that kind of maybe evidence kind of the, I don't know, I want to call it lamentable, because they just certainly had their playoff years of success, but they never, to your point earlier, never really kind of won it all, right? And there's a point at which I guess Oilers fans sort of almost became, resigned to the fact that this was just a team that was just never going to get there.
Yeah, it's the same old syndrome. I mean, just very briefly, we saw it at the University of Houston in their basketball program. You may recall Phi Slamma Jamma, the Guy Lewis teams that went to the Final Four 3 straight years and lost. And so Guy Lewis was a bum because they never won the national championship. Well, in the years that after they did get rid of him, or after he did leave, they pined for Guy Lewis. So there was some of that effect with the Oilers, I suppose. What defines the era? I don't know. When I think of defining moments, I think back to the Bum Phillips years. I could give you a number of them from that era. From the 80s, it was, what did you do at practice? Well, we stood around for 2 hours and then we went home. That was Hugh Campbell. Then when they got better under Glanville, it was Glanville passing out. He had, if I remember right, it was an Army helmet, the sort of thing soldiers wear in the trenches, that he handed out after a game to a special teams player who exhibited the most kamikaze zeal. He took out a player on the other team, that sort of thing. Glanville strutted around wearing this silver belt buckle that was about half as big as he was. And I think I said in the column one time he pushed it into the stadium in a wheelbarrow in front of him. He was I think everybody knows him. He did some TV commentary later on. He was a bit of a Napoleon type, and he had a certain cadre of players who bought into his act and went for his inducements, and a probably bigger group that thought it was all pretty ridiculous. And again, they had good talent because Mike Holovac drafted. Holovac came in as executive vice president or something like that, and then eventually became general manager. He was in charge of the draft the whole time, so he had a number of years there, and they had names that, if you follow pro football, you know these guys. You know the name of Bruce Matthews and Mike Munchak, and Dean Steinkuhler had some injuries and wasn't ever as good as those guys, but he was a heck of a talent as well. So there were linemen. I always suspected they drafted linemen in the first round because they were cheaper to sign. But in any case, they played at a high level. But I'll tell you one memory that comes flying back: a playoff game in Denver, Mile High Stadium. Glanville decided, backed up down inside his own 10-yard line to run a gadget play that he called Stagger Lee. And he had a pass go out to a receiver on the flank, but it wasn't a pass. It was a backward pass, so it was a lateral. Well, it was recovered for a touchdown by the Broncos, who went on to win rather handily. And so there was an illustration of how Glanville, trying to demonstrate how clever he was, put his team in a big bind.
It's perhaps emblematic, no, around this franchise. I want to put that maybe in context, because the ending of the story in Houston just seems to be, I don't know. I mean, maybe in hindsight, you could sort of say you could have seen this coming, but I wonder at the time when Adams was, trying to rustle up the stadium issue in this case, just a number of years after, well, not even 10 years after shaking down the county and the city for renovations to the Dome, he was back with proverbial 10-gallon hat in hand, clamoring for a brand new stadium altogether, right? Which wasn't going to happen, right? I mean, how did you see this from your lens, from what you remember, this story kind of playing out? Was this sort of they're out of here in slow motion, or was it not that clear in your mind what was going to happen to this franchise in the 90s?
Well, it became clear to me personally the day I had that conversation with Bob Lanier, the mayor, when he said, I can't. Lanier was an old-fashioned deal maker. He was a real estate developer by trade, very successful one, who became a very successful politician because he knew how to make deals. He was, I probably shouldn't say this, but he was what Donald Trump wanted to be. Well, he.
By the way, this will be dropping after the election, so who knows what that will mean. But anyway, go ahead.
That's good. He was very good at bringing people together and making deals. And he said, I can't make this happen. It just won't work. People aren't going to get behind a huge bond issue while all this money is still owed on the Astrodome. So that was when it became clear to me that this thing was going nowhere. And yes, indeed, they were going to leave. And of course, now we had all the prophets of doom saying, well, it'll be forever before Houston gets another NFL franchise. It turned out just to be a few years. How many years was it? 4 or 5, something like that.
I think that's right.
Yeah. But at that point, the jig was up. That was all that was that was all that could be done. That was all that was going to be done. And so now we start getting these visuals of Bud jetting off to Nashville and putting his deal there in place. So they did their deal. The Oilers were supposed to play in Houston 3 more years while the stadium was being built in Nashville. And that turned out in the first year to be every bit the disaster you might have predicted.
Well, sure, it's become a lame duck thing, right? My understanding is that with the end of the 95 season is when it was announced. But when was it in the air? Was it before then, or was it really a surprise when the announcement came in the end of the 95 season?
Well, I think it came into focus for people in 95. Yeah, and so they're supposed to play 3 more years. Well, in 96, they had crowds, not every game, but some games of fewer than 30,000 fans. I mean, this is football country. That was unheard of. Good team, bad team, whatever. But people were just, they were past the anger stage. It was, we don't care anymore. They've decided to go, so we're sort of writing them out of history, or at least out of our current context. And so the league stepped in and got everybody together, and they decided they'd go to Memphis because there was a suitable stadium there, and play for 2 years there until the stadium was ready in Nashville, and that's what happened.
Yeah, and the fans in Memphis didn't like that either because they knew it was a goner situation there too. They were just a temporary way station, right? And that's that too. Exactly. I'm sure. Just yeah. So how about Jeff Fisher? I was going to say, how about Jeff Fisher, the coach at the time, right? I think it's lost on all of us in this because it was Fisher, obviously a big a character in where the now Titans sort of came into being, but Fisher was the coach of this thing in 95 and 96. I mean, he must have, and frankly, brought them back to a little bit of respectability. But how does he and his staff and the players sort of handle all this? Because we're talking about a very, traumatic kind of period of time. The last years in Houston, the couple of years in Memphis while the Nashville thing sort of plays out, and then ultimately trying to domicile in Nashville. That could not have been helpful or easy in this process either.
No, Fisher was a good man. He handled it professionally and even stoically. He just kept his mouth shut. He took his lumps. He did the best he could with what he had. And I think it's fortunate he was rewarded by getting to stay on. He had been on staff. He'd been the secondary coach before he was promoted to head coach. So he'd been around. He knew where the bodies were buried. He knew the personalities involved. And he just bit his lip, his tongue, and kept his head down and handled it all as well as anyone could have, I think. So it was good that he got to have a taste of success after they finally got to Nashville.
So as the team is overstaying its welcome, I guess, 95, 96, and the team sort of fumbles its way into Tennessee and then ultimately to Nashville by 99. So give me a sense of, was there any feeling of abandonment by the fans and or the sports media there in Houston, or was it kind of good riddance? And I guess the kicker of that question is, what were the Houston fans and maybe even the sports media feeling once the Titans in their first year in Nashville went all the way to the Super Bowl? Was there sort of indignation was there sort of closet rooting for the team, or was it pretty much a clean break because you had your chance and you left us and we don't really care how you're doing going forward? Like, I guess the lingering fandom, is there still any during that process of leaving and then ultimately where they've been living for years since?
Well, there's always going to be some nostalgia. I mean, over the years, I still occasionally get an email now and then from somebody who said, "Hey, I just reread your book," that sort of thing. So there are always going to be a few. But I would say Houston processed the Oilers leaving in 95. Well, really in 95, there was anger then. There was righteous indignation. And there was some, and it wasn't all directed at Bud Adams. There were the diehard fans that thought that the city and the mayor should have done whatever was necessary to keep the team in Houston. So all that was processed then. By 96, the deal was done. signed his contract in Nashville, and so it was let's move on, and that's what the city did. It was, whatever thought there was put into pro football in Houston back then was, what are we going to do to get a new team? And I don't remember just when, but, discussions started about a new stadium. You could do a new stadium even with money owed on the Astrodome if Bud wasn't going to get the benefit of it, because he had been the guy who did the shakedown. So by the time the Tennessee Titans went to the Super Bowl, I don't know that Houston really noticed. It was as though the Seattle Seahawks had gone to the Super Bowl. That's my recollection going back those little over 20 years.
Well, and 99 was also the year that the new franchise was announced too. So maybe there was a little bit of a sting removal, I guess, from any of the lasting effects of that, right? But that said, you mentioned nostalgia, right? The Texans, really seem to sort of continue the tradition of sort of never really sort of getting over the hump, even frankly from the regular season, with some stellar performances and getting to, but so nostalgia for what, I guess it would be the question. I mean, the Texans, obviously brand new stadium, it's gorgeous, state of the art. They've been competitive on a number of occasions, but it almost feels to me sort of quite similar in terms of the inability, I guess, for that team to kind of get over the hump, not unlike the Oilers. Maybe sans even some of the stars of the Oilers, for that matter.
Yeah. Well, I think you really have to make a separation there. I don't think there's that much association between the Oilers and the Texans. It was, okay, we're going to stop this, and then eventually we're going to start this new thing. So, obviously a lot of people were fans of both, but I don't think there was any Oiler hangover that carried over to the Texans. There were high hopes. Bob McNair, the owner of the Texans, was a well-regarded businessman, obviously with a lot of money, and he put a lot of money into it. He put some of his own money into the stadium, which was an important gesture probably in terms of the popularity. But I don't think the Texans suffered any ill effect from the Oilers' years. I think whatever disapproval there's been of them, they earned on their own. They just this year got rid of a coach who was about as unpopular as a coach can be, who's going to the playoffs every year.
So we kind of obsess about, as we round the corner here, sort of where various team histories kind of sort of reside and or in the minds of fans, the mind of sports writers, whomever, the minds of historians, halls of fame, et cetera, where the sort of the legitimate history not only sort of resides, but can also legitimately be called back from. Now, this you said earlier in our lead up to a conversation, arcane. Well, this is certainly an arcane topic for sure, but I tend to believe that this stuff kind of matters. And I guess the question I'll ask you then, with that as the background or the backdrop, is where does the history, where do the memories, where does all the nostalgia and or the memories and the good, the bad, and the indifferent about this Houston Oilers franchise, where does it kind of reside? I mean, is it in the lineage? I guess officially the lineage resides into the Tennessee Titans, right? But the brand is long gone. It's dead. And it's been, replaced by a brand new franchise. Well, not brand new anymore, right? But at least a couple of decades old now. But the Houston Texans, right? And I guess the question is, if I'm multi-generational Houston football, pro football fan, and I know the Oilers story. Perhaps I was part of it in some way, shape, or form. Where do where do the allegiances kind of lie? Or is it basically a chapter in history that just is closed and there really isn't any, official sort of relationship from the Oilers story to that of either the Texans or the Titans?
No, I really don't think in the minds of most people in the Houston area there's a strong connection. The Oilers were over. That was, frankly, you've been kind enough to refer to the book I wrote, Loser Takes All. Frankly, looking back, and it didn't take, as a matter of fact, I hadn't even finished the book, which was published in 1997, that this occurred to me. As I say, I was approached on writing the book. I had not written a book up to that point, and so I wanted to take the project on. In retrospect, I would not have. And whatever the merits of the book as a piece of literature, the marketability was really limited because people in Houston had decided we're moving on. We're not angry anymore. We don't care anymore. And people in Nashville were not going to listen to anything negative about their new team and its owner, Bud Adams. And of course, there was a lot of negative about Bud and the history in the book. So, it was, this story is closed. We're going to start a new story in Houston. Tennessee, they're going to do their thing, but that's their thing, not ours.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I also kind of trying to struggle with, and again, I don't live in the Houston area and I've only followed the Texans sort of, just as an average NFL fan. And frankly, not as much as I used to, but that's another story. I wonder what like rivalries, right? So certainly there is artificial or at least sort of kindling of a rivalry with the Dallas Cowboys just because of the geography there, right? I don't know how much of it really is a rivalry, but you would think, or perhaps one of those potential rivalries could be, although maybe I'm just stirring it up now with nothing to sort of show for it, is that with the Tennessee Titans. I mean, they are both in the AFC South, and you'd think that maybe that could be an interesting, overlap or concentricity, if you will, between the old and the new, right? But both new teams or currently domiciled or currently iterated teams, and the old ghost, I guess, that kind of brings them together or perhaps inhabits some of their old rickety memories, right? That being the Houston Oilers. I don't know. They're just something that's interesting. You hate to sort of see all of that history, given especially that just amazing fandom in the late 70s and the great stories and some of the great players and stuff. And it's a shame, frankly, that there's no sort of real place, I guess, officially or maybe even unofficially, where that can sort of be, shall we say, remembered. Versus say some of these other teams that, can either officially have never left their places of domicile and can bring back, memorable clubs and players in their history and recall all kinds of stuff for their, regional sports networks for their preseason games and stuff. I mean, there's something in that history, and it's just a shame that it seems like there's no place perhaps for it to go.
Yeah, very little. Yeah, back in the beginning of the AFL, there was certainly a Houston-Dallas rivalry. I mean, Lamar Hunt in Dallas and Bud Adams in Houston founded the AFL, and they had two of the charter franchises, and they were both in Texas. And yeah, it was a big deal back then. And I wouldn't say there's nothing special about the Texans playing the Cowboys today. I think there is, but it's I don't know, maybe on a par with the Astros playing the Rangers. It's a bigger game than others, but not the end of the world. When the Oilers left, they took Jeff Fisher. They had Steve McNair by this time, and I think there were probably some people in Houston who followed him and a few of the other players after they left. But again, you might get a different take from somebody else. But my sense of it was, it's over, it's done, and we're out. They left us, and we're moving on. In terms of the history, for people who I guess have to be considered old timers now, I think certainly the fondest memories are the old Love You Blue days. That was the record is what it is. They never won the AFC Championship. They certainly didn't win a Super Bowl. But as a cultural phenomenon, it really was something special. And the people who lived through it still remember it fondly. They remember going to the pep rallies. They could probably name the whole roster for you from that era. And they hold this warm spot in their heart for Bum Phillips and Earl Campbell and Dan Pastorini and some others.
All right. How about some time to promote here? For those who are either new to the Oilers story or remember it and somehow want some kind of look back, and there's not a lot of writing about this team. And I believe the book from 97 is still in print, if I'm not mistaken. Just give our audience the title and the imprint, and is there any afterward, perhaps, even in your post-second career that you think might be rattling around in your brain or your old files? Tell us about the book.
Yeah, well, the book is titled Loser Takes All, and the subtitle is Bud Adams, Big Business and Bad Football. The book is not as much a sports story as a sports business story. The factors that coalesced, that came together to eventuate in the Oilers moving to Nashville and becoming the Tennessee Titans. There's no afterward, there's no postscript, because as we've been saying, when it ended, actually before it ended, Yogi was wrong. Sometimes it is over before it's over, and it was in this case. Anybody who is interested in the era, who's interested in the personalities of the era, and there are some other stories, of course, in the book that we haven't gotten around to. But yeah, you might enjoy it, and sure, you can find it on Amazon.com these days.
Many, many thanks to Father Ed. Tremendous conversation, tremendous story as well. And what a life, literally going from one career, literally across the complete end of the spectrum to quite another. And I just think it's an amazing journey. And that's what, frankly, life is all about, is that journey that we're all on together. But let us focus on the matter at hand. The book that you must get is available, of course, from our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just click on this episode number 189 with Ed Fowler, and you will find a link to Loser Takes All, Bud Adams, Bad Football, and Big Business. It is published by Longstreet Press. It came out in 1997. It's still readily available. You can find it really wherever good books are found. But if you buy it from our link there, our Amazon link on our website, we'll get a couple of shekels of love, as will, of course, Father Ed. As we would love to send a few more book sales his way for a story that will continue to fascinate us, and hopefully we'll get into some more conversations about the Houston Oilers. Let's see. Besides thanking Ed, I want to mention that we dropped a couple of songs in the midst of that conversation. And for those of you who either don't have your own copies already or want to find out more about them, one was the Love You Blue song, Love You Blue by Mac Hayes. That came out in 1980, and obviously it sounds a lot like the old Beatles song Love You Do, of course. Obviously, Messrs. Lennon and McCartney are credited as co-songwriters because they wrote the music and the tune, of course. That's on Ram Records, came out in 1980. And that was sort of part of the official trademarked Love You Blue phenomenon back in the day. And part of that mixture, of course, was the other song that we dropped in the midst of that interview with Ed, literally called Houston Oilers #1. That's the one I remember as a kid. And that's by Lee Offman and Gridnitz. I don't know how that name came about, but that's on MOM Records, M-O-M Records. I don't know what M-O-M stands for, because on the record sleeve there, it's abbreviated M.O.M. So it stands for something. I'm sure somebody in our listening audience will know what that means or stands for. That came out, I believe, in 1978, if I'm not mistaken. And it's interesting. I think Houston, the Oilers, perhaps over-indexed in novelty songs associated with the team. I think it's probably the most amount. And stay tuned in a second. You're going to see even yet another one in the mix. But before we get to that, I want to thank our pal Jerry Payne. Jerry Payne, Audio Excellence. He has done, once again, yeoman's-like work in helping getting our show together and stitched into something comprehensible. We thank you, kind sir, of course. And don't forget to check us out on social media. You'll find us at the various places, such as Twitter at Good Seats Still. You'll find us on Instagram at Good Seats Still Available. And yes, you'll find a little page devoted to us as well at or on Facebook. Let's see. Also, you want to send us email, please do so at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. If you'd like to sign up for our newsletter, our little weekly sort of tip sheet on what's going to be the topic of the week, you can find that, as well as a bunch of other stuff, as well as all of our old episodes, by the way, at our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Thanks for visiting that early and often. And okay, let's leave you with yet another great novelty tune, perhaps one that's a little less known, but was a discovered gem in our little research effort here this week. We leave you now with the dulcet tones of perhaps one of the well-known and well-regarded star players. Yeah, singing the song. You know him as number 00. It's Kenny Burrow and the B Team singing from 1979. This is when they were getting ready to maybe make a run. The Super Bowl Itch. Yeah, it was on Cherry Records. Lyrics by Barbara Livitz and Linda Miller. Music by David Healy. Here it is in all 4 minutes and 18 seconds worth of its disco goodness. It's the Super Bowl Itch. All right, itch away, friends. Take care. We'll see you next week. Thanks for listening. Bye.
There's something going round down in Houston town. It's caught by young and old. Can't shake it, so I'm told. Contagious as can be. There's no immunity. Reaching a fever pitch. It's called the Super Bowl Itch. It hits you with a zing. Makes you do crazy things. Rocky forgets to fight. Dracula won't bite. Let Campbell get the praise. Just give me the raise. Reaching a fever pitch. It's called the Super Bowl Itch. ways.